If Germany had developed the atomic bomb first during World War II, the entire course of human history would have changed in ways we can barely imagine. In our real history, Germany actually had a head start in nuclear physics. In the 1930s, German scientists were the best in the world at understanding atoms and radiation. Albert Einstein was German, though he left because he was Jewish and saw the danger coming. Werner Heisenberg, Otto Hahn, and many other brilliant minds were working in German laboratories. When scientists discovered nuclear fission in Berlin in 1938, splitting uranium atoms and releasing enormous energy, Germany was at the forefront of this new science. But in our reality, Germany's atomic bomb program failed for several reasons. Hitler didn't really understand or support it fully. Many of the best Jewish scientists had fled the country. The German program made some wrong calculations about how much uranium they would need. The Allies also bombed the heavy water plant in Norway that Germany needed for their reactors. By 1945, Germany's atomic program was years behind the American Manhattan Project. Now imagine if things had gone differently. Imagine if Hitler had recognized the bomb's importance earlier, perhaps in 1940 or 1941. Imagine if the German scientists had made the right calculations. Imagine if they had secured enough uranium from Czechoslovakia and enough heavy water from Norway before the Allies could interfere. Imagine if just a few things had gone right for Germany instead of wrong. In the autumn of 1943, at a secret testing site deep in occupied Poland, far from prying eyes and civilian populations, German scientists would have gathered for the most important experiment in human history. The location would have been carefully chosen, perhaps near the Blizna V2 rocket testing range or in some other remote area where the Reich had already cleared out local populations. Security would have been absolutely overwhelming, with SS troops forming rings around the test site, sworn to secrecy under pain of death. The bomb itself would have been a crude device by later standards, perhaps 10 feet long and weighing several tons. It would have been assembled by hand over weeks or months, with each component checked and rechecked by nervous scientists who knew that one mistake could either cause a premature detonation or a complete failure. The fissionable core, containing enriched uranium painstakingly separated from ordinary uranium in hidden facilities across Germany and occupied territories, would have been inserted at the last possible moment. When the countdown reached 0 and the device detonated, the flash of light would have been visible across half of Poland. The fireball would have been hotter than the surface of the sun, instantly vaporizing the steel tower holding the bomb, the instruments placed around the test site, and everything else within a mile. The shock wave would have flattened trees and buildings for several miles in every direction. Within seconds, a mushroom cloud would have begun rising into the stratosphere, eventually reaching heights of 40 or 50,000 feet, visible from Warsaw itself. The German scientists watching from bunkers several miles away would have experienced a mixture of emotions impossible to fully describe. They would have felt pride in their scientific achievement, having solved one of nature's most difficult puzzles. They would have felt fear, knowing they had unleashed something that could destroy entire cities. Some might have felt regret, understanding that they had given history's most evil regime the most terrible weapon ever created. But all of them would have understood that the world had just changed forever and that Germany now held an advantage that could win the war. Within hours, reports would have reached Hitler's headquarters, wherever he was at that moment. The Führer would have been ecstatic, seeing the atomic bomb as confirmation of his theories about German scientific and racial superiority. He would have immediately summoned his top military commanders and Nazi party leaders for an emergency conference. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, would have been there. Heinrich Himmler, leader of the SS, would have attended. Albert Speer, the armaments minister, would have provided details about production capabilities. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, would have begun thinking about how to use this information for psychological warfare. The debates in that room would have been intense and would have revealed the different personalities and priorities of Nazi leadership. Göring, always eager for glory and dramatic gestures, would likely have urged immediate use against London or Moscow, wanting to shock the world into submission with one devastating blow. Himmler, more calculating and concerned with maintaining SS power, might have argued for using the bombs to eliminate concentrations of enemies within occupied territories first, ensuring Germany's grip on its conquests before turning the weapon against external foes. Speer, the most technically minded of the group, would have cautioned about production realities. He would have explained that even with a successful design, manufacturing additional bombs would take considerable time. The uranium enrichment facilities could only process so much material. The precision components required skilled labor and rare materials. The heavy water needed for certain reactor processes was in limited supply. Germany might be able to produce one bomb every 2 or 3 months initially, perhaps accelerating to one per month with expanded facilities. Each bomb was incredibly precious and could not be wasted. Hitler himself would have likely swung between different options as his mood changed. In his more grandiose moments, he would have dreamed of using atomic bombs to literally reshape the map of Europe, destroying entire cities that resisted German rule and creating a landscape of terror that would make resistance unthinkable. In his more paranoid moments, he would have worried that the Allies were also developing atomic weapons and that Germany needed to strike first before the advantage slipped away. In his more calculating moments, he might have seen the value of holding the bombs in reserve as the ultimate threat, using the psychological impact without actually having to use the weapons themselves. Goebbels would have recognized the propaganda value regardless of what choice they made. Simply announcing that Germany possessed atomic weapons would terrify Germany's enemies and might cause their populations to pressure their governments into surrender. But he would also have worried that if Germany announced the bomb's existence without using it, the Allies might not believe it was real, dismissing it as German propaganda and psychological warfare. Actual use against a real target would eliminate any doubt and create maximum psychological impact. The decision would not have been made lightly or quickly, but ultimately, the logic of the Nazi regime pointed toward use rather than restraint. The Nazis had never hesitated to use terror and overwhelming force before, and they would not have started showing restraint now. Most likely, Germany would have tried to use the bomb to knock Britain out of the war first. By late 1943, Germany was already struggling on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union, and the Western Allies were preparing to invade Europe. Britain was the base for Allied bombers that were destroying German cities night after night. Eliminating Britain would have been Hitler's top priority. Germany would have needed a way to deliver the bomb to a British city. Their early atomic bombs would have been large and heavy, requiring a big aircraft to carry them. The Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, had long-range bombers, but they would have struggled to reach Britain and return safely by 1943. British air defenses and fighter planes were strong. Germany might have lost several bombers trying to deliver their precious atomic weapons. But eventually, one would have gotten through. Imagine a German bomber reaching London on a cold morning in early 1944. The plane drops a single bomb that explodes above the city with the force of 20,000 tons of conventional explosives. In an instant, everything within 2 miles of the explosion is destroyed. Buildings are vaporized, trees are turned to ash, people are killed so quickly they don't even know what happened. The blast wave flattens structures for miles beyond the initial fireball. A mushroom cloud rises into the sky, visible across southern England. Hundreds of thousands of people would have died instantly. Hundreds of thousands more would have been injured by burns, radiation, and debris. The heart of the British Empire, the city that had withstood the Blitz, would have been devastated in a single moment. The psychological impact would have been even more crushing than the physical destruction. Humanity had never seen anything like this before. The British government would have been thrown into chaos. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, if he survived, would have faced an impossible situation. Germany would have quickly announced they had more atomic bombs and would use them on other British cities unless Britain surrendered immediately. Churchill was famously stubborn and determined never to surrender. But could he sacrifice Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool, and Glasgow to continue fighting? The British people would have been terrified in a way they had never been during the conventional bombing of the Blitz. You could hide from regular bombs in shelters and subways. You could shoot down enemy planes and rebuild damaged buildings. But against atomic bombs, there was no defense. One plane, one bomb, and an entire city would cease to exist. The pressure on Churchill to make peace would have been enormous. But would Churchill have surrendered? Probably not immediately. He would have known that giving in to Hitler's demands would mean the end of Britain as a free nation. He would have appealed desperately to America for help. President Franklin Roosevelt would have faced a terrible choice. America's own atomic bomb program was still at least a year away from producing a working weapon. America could continue supporting Britain, but that would risk Germany using atomic bombs on American cities or American troops. Or America could step back and let Britain face Germany alone. Roosevelt, like Churchill, was not a man who gave up easily. He probably would have assured Britain that America would continue the fight and would rush their own atomic bomb program to completion. But before America could help, Germany would have struck Britain again. Liverpool or Manchester would have been next, another several 100,000 people killed in an atomic flash. After 2 or 3 atomic bombings, Britain would have been forced to negotiate some kind of peace, even if it wasn't a complete surrender. With Britain neutralized or rendered incapable of launching offensive operations against the continent, Nazi Germany would have inevitably pivoted its full attention eastward toward the Soviet Union. This confrontation represented far more than a conventional military campaign. It was an ideological death struggle between 2 totalitarian visions that could tolerate no compromise. Hitler and Stalin understood with crystalline clarity that their conflict was existential. The world was not large enough for both their empires to survive. By the closing months of 1943 and the opening of 1944, the tide of conventional warfare had turned decisively against Germany on the Eastern Front. The Red Army, having absorbed catastrophic losses that would have broken any other nation, had transformed itself into an increasingly formidable fighting force. Soviet industrial production, relocated beyond the Ural Mountains and operating at maximum capacity, churned out tanks, aircraft, and artillery at rates the Germans could not hope to match. The Wehrmacht faced not merely superior numbers but a Soviet military machine that had learned from its early disasters and now combined numerical superiority with improving tactical sophistication and an unshakable determination forged in the crucible of the Great Patriotic War. The introduction of atomic weapons into this equation would have fundamentally altered the strategic calculus. Germany would have deployed these weapons with ruthless efficiency against both Soviet military concentrations and urban centers. The psychological and practical impact would have been devastating beyond measure. A single atomic bomb detonated over Moscow could have decapitated the entire Soviet leadership structure in one apocalyptic instant. Stalin himself, the embodiment of Soviet resistance and the iron-fisted coordinator of the war effort, might have been vaporized along with the entire apparatus of government. Millions of civilians would have perished in the initial blast and firestorm, while the political vacuum created by such devastation could have fractured the Soviet state. Beyond strikes on the capital, German atomic bombs could have targeted the concentrations of Soviet armor and infantry that characterized Red Army operations. Traditional military tactics assumed that massing forces created overwhelming offensive power. Atomic weapons would have transformed such concentrations into optimal targets for annihilation. Entire Soviet army groups, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, thousands of tanks and artillery pieces, could have been obliterated in single attacks. The calculus of attrition warfare would have been rewritten overnight. The industrial cities of the Urals, which had become the Soviet Union's manufacturing heartland after the evacuation of Western factories, would have presented ideal targets for atomic attack. Cities like Chelyabinsk, Magnitogorsk, and Sverdlovsk, producing the tanks, aircraft, and weapons systems that sustained Soviet resistance, could have been systematically destroyed. Each atomic strike would have eliminated not only current production capacity but also the skilled workers and engineers who made that production possible, creating cascading effects throughout the Soviet war economy. Yet the Soviet Union possessed certain characteristics that might have enabled it to absorb even atomic punishment more effectively than Britain. The country's vast geographical expanse meant that even dozens of atomic bombs could not physically occupy or destroy the entire territory. The Soviet population, already hardened by years of unimaginable suffering, the siege of Leningrad, the Battle of Stalingrad, the deliberate starvation campaigns, had demonstrated a capacity for endurance that defied Western comprehension. Stalin had already sacrificed millions of his citizens with cold calculation. He might have been willing to sacrifice millions more rather than submit to Nazi domination. However, there exist limits even to Russian endurance. While the Soviet Union could replace lost soldiers through its enormous population reserves, atomic weapons would have destroyed trained armies faster than replacements could be mobilized and equipped. Soviet cities, regardless of their strategic importance, would have faced systematic annihilation. The psychological impact of watching major urban centers vanish in atomic firestorms, Leningrad, Kiev, Minsk, one after another, would have gradually eroded even the most determined resistance. By the middle of 1944, assuming Germany had achieved sufficient atomic bomb production, the Reich could have forced both Britain and the Soviet Union into armistice or outright surrender. The Third Reich would have emerged as the undisputed master of Europe, its domain stretching from the Atlantic coast to the frontiers of Asia. The historical irony would have been profound. Millions who perished in the final year of World War II in our timeline might have lived, yet millions more would have died in atomic fire, and the Nazi regime, which our timeline saw destroyed, would instead have stood triumphant and seemingly invincible. This brings us to America and the question of what would have happened next. Even with Britain and the Soviet Union defeated, Germany and America would have remained enemies. The United States would have continued racing to develop their own atomic bomb. The Manhattan Project would have been given unlimited resources and top priority. American scientists, many of them refugees from Nazi Germany, would have worked around the clock to match what Germany had accomplished. America would have succeeded in building atomic bombs, probably by late 1944 or early 1945. As soon as America had working bombs, they would have faced the same question Germany had faced: how to use them. America could not easily bomb German cities because the distance was too far for their bombers. But America would have developed long-range bombers specifically for this purpose, or they might have used bases in neutral countries. More likely, America would have announced they had atomic bombs and warned Germany that any attack on the United States or its interests would result in German cities being destroyed. This would have created a standoff, what we would later call a Cold War, but starting years earlier and with Nazi Germany as America's opponent instead of the Soviet Union. Hitler, already in poor health by this point, would have been satisfied with his conquests in Europe. He would have consolidated Nazi control over the continent, continuing the Holocaust and the oppression of conquered peoples. The Nazi regime would have used atomic weapons or the threat of them to maintain control. Any resistance movement or uprising would have been met with overwhelming force, possibly even atomic attack. The world that emerged from this alternate World War II would have been darker and more terrible than anything in our real history. Nazi Germany would have controlled most of Europe, ruling over hundreds of millions of people. The Holocaust would have continued or even accelerated, with more European Jews and other groups murdered in death camps. The Nazi racial ideology would have been imposed across the continent. In this world, there would have been no liberation of concentration camps by Allied soldiers, no Nuremberg trials holding Nazi leaders accountable for their crimes. The evidence of Nazi atrocities would have been hidden or destroyed. Many people might not have learned the full truth about what the Nazis had done. Some might have even believed Nazi propaganda about their rule being beneficial. America would have remained democratic and free but would have been isolated and surrounded by hostile powers. Japan might have remained in control of much of East Asia and the Pacific. The British Empire would have collapsed faster than it did in our real history. The Soviet Union, if it survived at all, would have been reduced to a small portion of its former territory. The world would have been divided between Nazi-controlled Europe, American-influenced parts of the Western Hemisphere, and Japanese-controlled parts of Asia. The atomic standoff between America and Nazi Germany would have been even more dangerous than the Cold War between America and the Soviet Union in our real history. The Nazi regime was more aggressive and less rational than the Soviet leadership. Hitler and his followers believed in their racial destiny and might have been willing to risk everything in an atomic war. America would have had to constantly remain on guard against surprise attack. Over the following decades, the world would have developed very differently. Without the United Nations being created under American and Allied leadership, there would have been no international organization promoting human rights and cooperation. The concept of human rights itself would have been much weaker, with the Nazi regime actively promoting the opposite idea that some people were superior to others. Science and technology would have advanced in strange ways. Nazi Germany would have poured resources into weapons development and racial theories. Some areas of science might have advanced quickly under Nazi pressure, while others, especially anything involving Jewish or non-Aryan scientists, would have been suppressed. The free exchange of scientific ideas that drove progress in our world would have been replaced by secrecy and militarization. In America and other free countries, society would have been on a permanent war footing. Civil liberties might have been restricted in the name of security. The government would have maintained huge military forces and would have developed more powerful weapons to counter the Nazi threat. The culture would have been more militaristic and fearful. For ordinary people living in Nazi-controlled Europe, life would have been oppressive and dangerous. Those who fit the Nazi racial ideal might have lived reasonably well, though always under the watchful eye of the state. Those who didn't fit the ideal, or anyone who resisted or questioned the regime, would have faced imprisonment, forced labor, or death. The vibrant diversity of European culture would have been replaced by rigid Nazi uniformity. The atomic standoff could not have lasted forever. Eventually, either the Nazi regime would have collapsed from within, or a war would have broken out between the nuclear powers. If the Nazi regime had collapsed, perhaps after Hitler's death and fighting among his successors, the liberation of Europe would have been even more dramatic and emotional than it was in our real history. People who had lived under Nazi rule for decades would have finally been free. The truth about Nazi crimes would have emerged, shocking the world even more than it did. If nuclear war had broken out between America and Nazi Germany, the destruction would have been unimaginable. By the 1950s or 60s, both sides would have had hundreds of atomic bombs, and later hydrogen bombs thousands of times more powerful. A full-scale nuclear war could have killed hundreds of millions of people and made large parts of the planet uninhabitable. Human civilization might not have survived. There is a third possibility. The standoff might have continued for generations, with Nazi Germany eventually moderating somewhat and joining the international community, much as China did in our real world despite remaining under communist rule. Young Germans born after the war might have questioned their parents' ideology and pushed for change. Economic pressures might have forced the Nazi regime to open up to trade and cooperation with other countries. Gradually, over many decades, Nazi Germany might have transformed into something less evil, though the scars of what they had done would have remained forever. Looking at this alternate history, we can see several important lessons. First, small changes can have enormous consequences. If a few decisions had been different, if a few people had made different choices, Germany could have developed atomic bombs first and changed the course of history. We were closer to this outcome than most people realize. Second, technological power without moral wisdom is extremely dangerous. Nazi Germany with atomic bombs would have been the nightmare combination of advanced science and evil ideology. The fact that America and its allies developed atomic weapons first, rather than Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan, made an enormous difference to human history. The people who possessed the first atomic bombs were not saints, but they were far more moral and restrained than the alternatives. Third, the outcome of World War II was not inevitable. We sometimes think that the good guys were bound to win because they were good, but history doesn't work that way. The Allies won because of specific decisions, sacrifices, and circumstances. If Germany had gotten atomic bombs first, evil would have triumphed, at least for a time. Finally, we should be grateful for the world we actually got rather than this darker alternative. Yes, our real history included the horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Cold War, and many other problems. But at least Nazi Germany was defeated, the Holocaust ended, Europe was liberated, and democracy survived and spread. As imperfect as our world is, it could have been so much worse. The question of what would have happened if Germany had developed the atomic bomb first reminds us how contingent history really is. We live in one of many possible timelines, and we were fortunate that certain crucial moments went the way they did. It also reminds us that we cannot take progress or morality for granted. The same scientific knowledge that can improve human life can also be used to destroy it. The same human intelligence that creates wonders can also create horrors. We must always be vigilant and work to ensure that knowledge and power are used for good rather than evil, because the alternative is too terrible to contemplate.